Have you ever fallen into such a state of confusion that you became utterly exhausted after trying every possible method, devising countless plans, and taking constant action to change your circumstances, only to find that everything around you remained chaotic and continued slipping beyond your control? We live in a society obsessed with busyness, where people are conditioned to believe that achieving results requires them to keep straining themselves, to react frantically, and to never allow themselves to stop, even for a single second. The fear of being left behind drives us into action as though it were an instinct for survival, only for us to realize bitterly that the more desperately we struggle in panic, the tighter we pull the knots of our own lives. You are drained from carrying too much, yet you tremble at the thought of letting go, because deep within, you believe that if you stop, your entire world will immediately collapse. And yet, the great psychoanalyst Carl Jung offers a completely reversed and astonishing perspective. It is precisely this obsessive desire for control that becomes the greatest obstacle preventing reality from arranging itself. According to Jung, when you continuously force reality through fear, you are being completely manipulated by the crude ego. Your frantic attempts to interfere with external circumstances do not resolve the problem. They merely continue to emit the frequency of lack and insecurity. Jung pointed out that the unconscious, together with the profound wisdom of the self, can never be forced into maturity through an act of demanding will. At the crucial turning points of human life, every effort born from panic creates only further collapse. By contrast, remaining still and refusing to react is the highest expression of inner self-mastery, creating the conditions for natural energy to restore itself to a state of balance. If you are facing an inescapable crisis, a decision of life and death importance, or a fateful void in which you do not know what to do next, then today's video is a sacred message meant especially for you. Together, we will explore the art of doing nothing through the lens of Carl Jung's depth psychology, so that we may understand why, when you courageously release your grip and stop resisting, every piece of your life begins to shift on its own and fall into the place where it has always belonged. Do not turn off this video, because the moments ahead may not teach you how to fight in order to gain more, but they will place in your hands the ultimate key to ending every inner battle, opening the way to a steady and natural magnetism that you never imagined you possessed. Part 1. The unconscious, the force coordinating everything you think you are consciously directing. Number 1. The personal unconscious, self-deception within desire. Most of us believe that we understand very clearly what we are pursuing. Some long for a brilliant career, some hope for a fulfilling love, while others devote their entire lives to seeking peace or a sense of completeness. Yet if we continue questioning ourselves to the very end about what compels us to possess those things at all costs, very few people can answer with ease. It was precisely within this blind spot that Carl Jung recognized the silent coordination of the unconscious. He once concluded, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." What human beings mistakenly perceive as free choices are, in truth, merely the results of hidden currents operating beneath the surface without our awareness. According to Jung, the personal unconscious is where all experiences pushed aside by consciousness are stored. Painful memories, feelings of shame, wounds, disappointments, and dreams that were once denied do not disappear after being forgotten. They simply leave the field of conscious awareness and continue to exist within a deeper layer of the mind. Over time, these repressed contents crystallize into psychological complexes, silently shaping how people feel, choose, and respond to life. This is why many desires that appear entirely rational do not actually arise from inner freedom. A person who spends decades pursuing social status may not truly love power, but may instead be trying to compensate for the feeling of having been looked down upon many years earlier. Another person may constantly crave an intense love, not necessarily because they wish to find a companion, but because deep within, the hunger for affection from childhood has never subsided. What they passionately pursue in the present is, in reality, only the reflection of an emptiness that has never been acknowledged. Desire then ceases to be the voice of the present and becomes the lingering echo of the past. More significantly, the unconscious never abandons what it wants to have seen. What is denied today will return in another form tomorrow. Jung once emphasized, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." For this reason, many people repeatedly enter the same kind of toxic relationship, experience the same form of failure, or endure the same pain, then sigh and believe that fate is working against them. In reality, what repeats itself is not the circumstance, but the unconscious content that has never been brought into consciousness. Life is merely changing the setting again and again in order to deliver the same lesson. The language of the unconscious is also completely different from the language of reason. It does not argue through words, but expresses itself through dreams, emotions that suddenly erupt, fears that are difficult to explain, or an intense attraction toward a particular person or situation. Every reaction that appears irrational is a signal that a hidden part of the soul is attempting to step into the light. Yet the ego is rarely patient enough to listen. It immediately searches for a new goal, a new plan, or a new form of busyness to conceal the anxiety rising from within. It is precisely here that self-deception within desire is formed. The more a person believes that attaining one more thing will finally make them happy, the more they unconsciously affirm that they are still not enough in the present. Every effort begins to revolve around filling the emptiness rather than understanding its origin. A person who constantly needs recognition will never feel satisfied, because the motivation behind their striving is built upon the belief that they do not possess enough value. The unconscious does not create the external world, but it determines how we perceive the world, and that perception leads us toward the same familiar experiences again and again. For this reason, Jungian therapy has never aimed to eliminate the unconscious. What is needed is not the destruction of the dark parts of the soul, but learning how to enter into dialogue with them. Instead of asking how to escape fear, Jung was always concerned with what lay behind that fear. Instead of rushing to correct an emotion, he searched for the meaning that the emotion was trying to convey. Only when people stop resisting and begin listening does the unconscious no longer need to speak through recurring events in their lives. In modern society, the unconscious has more opportunities than ever to reveal itself. Constant comparison, the pressure to succeed faster, stand out more, or receive greater recognition causes many people to mistake these demands for their authentic desires. Yet behind every such race, there is often only the fear of being left behind, forgotten, or regarded as worthless. Until this is recognized, the more effort people make, the more power the unconscious gains to continue manipulating the entire course of their lives. Therefore, the first step of awakening does not lie in obtaining what one desires, but in daring to question the desire itself. What within me wants this? Does this voice belong to freedom, or does it arise from an old wound? Only when a person is honest enough to confront that question do they begin to separate themselves from the invisible guidance of the unconscious. From that moment onward, desire is no longer an attempt to patch the deficiencies of the past, but becomes the natural expression of a soul that is maturing. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Enlightenment does not come from dreaming of light, but from having the courage to illuminate the darkness within oneself. What you desire today may not be the final destination, but merely a doorway leading back to a part of your soul that is still waiting to be acknowledged. Only when the unconscious no longer directs life from behind the scenes does a person truly enter the process of individuation and, for the first time, live through their own choices rather than through the invisible impulses of the past. Beginning to listen to the unconscious does not require you to immediately produce lengthy analyses or perfect answers. Sometimes, awakening begins with a single moment in which you dare to stop and acknowledge your own presence. If, while listening to these words, you feel that a dark corner within you has just been given a name, leave a short phrase in the comments below. Aware or I see it. That simple word is not merely a response for the algorithm, but also a gentle nod that you offer to your own soul, affirming that from this day forward, you have begun to see the hidden currents and are ready to learn how to enter into dialogue with them. Number 2. The collective unconscious, the magnetic field of archetypes. If the personal unconscious resembles a room that only you have ever entered, where the memories and experiences of your own life are stored, then the collective unconscious resembles the vast sky that covers all of humanity. You may still believe that you are living a deeply personal story, yet long before you uttered your first cry, millions of people had already loved, lost, waited, hoped, and stood before similar crossroads. Only the faces, the eras, and the circumstances change. The psychological current beneath them remains almost unchanged. It was this deeper layer that inspired Carl Jung to develop the concept of the collective unconscious, a shared psychological foundation connecting all human beings beyond the boundaries of culture, history, and time. Jung did not regard the collective unconscious as a storehouse of ancestral memories in the ordinary sense. He described it as an innate psychological structure that every human being carries upon entering life. Within this structure exist universal patterns that he called archetypes. They are not fixed characters or images, but resemble invisible principles that guide the ways in which human beings love, explore, create, lead, and mature. Jung once wrote, "The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not?" This statement reveals an important truth. The quality of life depends not only upon the ego's capacity for control, but also upon whether a person recognizes that they belong to an order greater than themselves. This is also why similar symbols appear repeatedly across every civilization. Greek mythology tells of heroes journeying through trials. The Bible tells of people who are called to fulfill missions greater than themselves. Modern literature, cinema, and the inspirational stories of today still revolve around the same journey of discovery, maturation, and transformation. What allows billions of people to resonate with these stories does not lie in their settings or languages, but in the way archetypes touch the shared psychological layer of humanity. They awaken a deeply familiar feeling that is difficult to explain, as though the story had always existed somewhere within us before it was ever expressed in words. Imagine the collective unconscious as the magnetic field of the earth. No one can see it with the naked eye, yet every compass is silently influenced by the same force of attraction. Human beings are the same. Each person makes choices through their own consciousness, yet at a deeper level, archetypes continue to guide the way each life develops. When the ego constantly attempts to impose the outcome it desires, the needle of the inner compass is easily disturbed by impatience and the desire for control. Only when the need to force things begins to subside does the direction that has always existed gradually become clear. What many people call the right time is, in reality, the moment when the compass needle finally stops trembling and returns to its proper direction. Chloe, an interior designer in Seattle, spent 3 years relentlessly attending every business networking event in search of major contracts. Although Chloe always tried to smile brightly and handed out hundreds of business cards, her conversations never moved beyond strained social exchanges, while the projects she received consisted only of ordinary home renovation requests that left her exhausted. Drained by the hopeless pursuit, Chloe decided to withdraw from every networking event and shut herself inside her studio, devoting her full attention to her original passion, researching recycled materials and natural light. She began sharing her profound professional insights in a small specialist architectural journal, simply for the joy of expressing herself. Several months later, a representative from a green real estate corporation approached Chloe's studio and offered her the position of art director for a chain of luxury ecological hotels, a project for which they had spent more than a year searching for someone with precisely her aesthetic sensibility and design philosophy. Chloe no longer had to rush around handing out business cards. The greatest project of her career came to her the moment she began creating value from the wholeness of her own being. At this point, many people may easily assume that Jung was speaking about some mystical arrangement of fate. In reality, he never denied the role of action. What Jung sought to emphasize was that action only becomes valuable when it is aligned with the deeper processes of the psyche. The ego always believes that greater effort will cause every door to open more quickly. Archetypes operate according to a different principle. They do not respond to impatience, but resonate with an appropriate inner state. For this reason, once people stop forcing outcomes, many encounters, opportunities, and transformations begin to arise more naturally. This is not because the world suddenly changes, but because people no longer push themselves away from the path that the deeper layers of the psyche have always been silently guiding them toward. Philosophy has long used the image of flowing water to describe harmony with the laws of the universe. A river does not struggle against every stone in its path. By following the terrain, it still reaches the open sea. Jung's language is entirely different, yet the spirit of his thought meets this image at a beautiful point. Behind every individual effort, there is always a greater order. The more human beings attempt to impose the rhythm of the ego upon that order, the more conflict increases. Conversely, when they learn to listen to the movement of the archetypes, action does not disappear. It becomes timely, properly directed, and far less wasteful of energy. For this reason, do nothing in the spirit of Carl Jung has never meant surrender. What must cease is the ego's attempt to force an outcome, not life itself. A gardener does not use their hands to pull a seedling upward so that it will grow faster. They merely create the conditions for the seed to develop according to its inherent laws. Archetypes operate in the same way. They open the way to encounters, opportunities, and transitions at precisely the moment when the psychological structure of a person is ready to receive them. Every act of impatience merely causes this process to become disordered. In the end, you will recognize a beautiful paradox. Life does not truly begin to rearrange itself after you stop forcing it. That order has always been present. It is only because the ego continually interferes with the flow of the archetypes through its desire to control every outcome that you can no longer see it. When that interference subsides, the collective unconscious begins to fulfill its role as a silent magnetic field, connecting people with the right circumstances, the right opportunities, and the right relationships. This is also the deepest meaning of the invitation. Do nothing after this, and watch how everything falls into place. It does not mean ceasing to live, but ceasing to force, so that the hidden movement of the psyche may complete what the ego has never been capable of arranging on its own. Part 2. The greater the resistance, the more reality slips away. Before entering the deeper layers of the psyche, pause for a moment at a paradox that almost everyone has experienced. The more you hope someone will send you a message, the quieter your phone becomes. The more intensely you crave an opportunity, the more it seems to retreat several steps farther away. The harder you try to sleep, the longer your eyes remain awake into the night. Life seems to carry an inexplicable sense of irony. What we pursue with the greatest tension is often what becomes the most difficult to grasp. Many people attribute this to fate or bad luck, but psychology reveals an entirely different mechanism. Many failures do not arise because you have not tried hard enough, but because the very state of striving has distorted the way the brain perceives reality. The brain responds less to objective events than to the way it interprets those events. When a goal becomes excessively important, the nervous system automatically treats the failure to achieve it as a threat. The feeling of deprivation is immediately amplified. All attention is drawn toward what is missing rather than toward the resources that are already present. This is why someone desperately searching for a relationship sees only loneliness. Someone obsessed with money sees only the danger of loss. Someone consumed by the desire for success continually notices signs that they are still falling behind. External reality may not have changed at all, yet the inner picture has already been darkened by fear. Psychologists call this phenomenon attentional bias. When the mind is dominated by a concern, it begins prioritizing every piece of information that confirms that concern. You buy a red car and suddenly begin seeing red cars everywhere. The world has not changed. The brain has simply changed its filter. The same thing happens with the feeling of lack. When you believe that you do not yet have something, the mind continuously searches for evidence proving that belief. As a result, the harder you try, the more distant the destination appears, because every passing day becomes another reminder that you still have not obtained what you desire. What is even more dangerous is that tension does not merely distort perception, it also distorts behavior. When people act from fear, their decisions often become impulsive and extreme. Someone who is terrified of losing a partner repeatedly sends messages, checks on them, and tries to control them until that very suffocating pressure causes the relationship to fracture. Someone who is deeply afraid of missing an investment opportunity may rush into poorly considered decisions. Someone who desperately craves recognition often speaks more, proves more, and unintentionally creates an impression of strain and artificiality. The very thing they want to preserve becomes the first thing to slip from their grasp. Imagine holding sand in the palm of your hand. Instinctively, you tighten your grip when you fear the sand may fall. Yet that very pressure causes the grains to escape more quickly through your fingers. Many goals in life operate according to a similar principle. They require presence, clarity, and the ability to observe, rather than the rigidity of a tense mind. The more tightly you grasp through anxiety, the less space you leave for things to develop naturally. Sadly, most of us confuse control with effectiveness, even though the two do not always go together. A familiar example is the story of Ryan, a software engineer in Denver. After being rejected 3 times for a management position, he decided that he had to secure the next opportunity at all costs. Ryan spent weeks memorizing every answer, rehearsing every gesture, and placing himself under the pressure of believing that this was his final chance. When he entered the interview room, his mind kept repeating the thought, "I am not allowed to fail." That pressure made Ryan appear unnatural, caused him to give overly long answers, and led him to miss several simple questions. 6 months later, when he participated in another selection process with the sole intention of having an honest conversation about his professional experience, he received an offer for the exact position he had once pursued. His knowledge had barely changed. What changed was his psychological state. In practical psychology, this phenomenon is also connected to the paradox of control. The more people attempt to control things that can never be fully controlled, the greater their sense of helplessness becomes. This creates a tightly enclosed cycle. Anxiety causes you to exert more control. Greater control increases tension. Tension reduces performance, and disappointing results then reinforce the belief that you need to exercise even more control. The cycle continues until people are exhausted, still unable to understand why they have tried so hard, while everything remains at a standstill. Another phenomenon known as psychological reactance also helps explain this paradox. When people feel that their freedom is being threatened, they tend to resist the pressure, even when that pressure is self-imposed. The more you force yourself to be happy, the more clearly you feel that you are not happy enough. The more you command yourself to be confident, the more you notice moments of insecurity. The more you order yourself to forget someone, the more vividly that person appears in your mind. The brain is not skilled at obeying coercive commands. It responds with resistance, like a rubber band that snaps back more forcefully the farther it is stretched. Ancient Greek philosophy once offered an observation remarkably close to this principle. The Stoics clearly distinguished between what lies within human control and what lies beyond it. They did not encourage resignation. Instead, they emphasized that energy should be directed only toward what a person can genuinely decide. Every attempt to force the world to operate according to personal desire creates only further disappointment. Modern psychology reaches a similar conclusion through scientific language. The more people attempt to control variables beyond their influence, the longer the nervous system remains in a state of vigilance, reducing the ability to assess situations and make accurate decisions. This is also why Carl Jung's statement remains deeply relevant when he observed, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." Jung did not mean that everything you resist carries some mystical quality. He was pointing to a mechanism closely aligned with what psychology now confirms. Whatever you continuously resist occupies an ever greater space within consciousness. When attention becomes locked onto fear, that fear becomes the center of every decision. You no longer act in service of what you wish to build. You merely react to what you wish to avoid. It is precisely this reversal that causes reality to appear increasingly distant from your original desire. At this point, the message of "do nothing" begins to reveal a far more practical meaning. It does not tell you to abandon your goal or stop taking action. What must stop is the reflex to control that arises from the fear of deprivation. When that cycle ends, the brain no longer wastes energy searching for signs of failure. Perception becomes clearer, decisions become less impulsive, and actions become more flexible. The paradox is that many things you once struggled to hold on to begin moving closer the moment you stop pulling them through the rigidity of a tense mind. This is not magic. It is the natural consequence of ending an unnecessary war with your own perception. Part 3. Silence is not emptiness, it is the restructuring of the unconscious. After exhausting yourself by struggling in a battle against reality, a turning point will inevitably arrive, the moment when you suddenly realize that all the resistance you have maintained until now has been entirely meaningless. This is by no means a sign of weak surrender, but rather the awakening of awareness as you begin to see through the true nature of compulsive striving. The more passionately you attempt to control everything, the farther you are pushed away from the natural flow of life. Only when personal will is completely exhausted do the loud voices within the mind finally fall silent, and it is precisely from that profound stillness that an entirely new doorway has the chance to open. It is not the doorway of relentless effort, but the doorway of complete surrender in awareness. It is at that very moment that a person touches, for the first time, the genuine power of stillness. What we once feared as a meaningless emptiness now becomes a sacred space for life itself, where the unconscious quietly restructures and restores, where old energies naturally dissolve to make room for new possibilities to blossom. And within the profound silence that exists between a single fully surrendered breath, the true journey finally begins. The journey back to the original self, where non-action is no longer mistaken for helplessness, but becomes the highest expression of courage from a soul that has learned to place complete trust in its own natural unfolding. Number 1. Non-action from the wounded ego. The wounded ego is an extraordinarily clever entity, It dresses itself in the garments of reason, ambition, morality, and even false positivity to convince us that we are moving in the right direction. Yet if you look deeply enough, you will discover that most of what we do, the choices we make, whom we love, what profession we pursue, even the way we choose to present ourselves, arise not from freedom, but from the fear of being wounded once again. We act not because we genuinely want to, but because we feel we must. We must prove ourselves, protect ourselves, and maintain control. When action arises from that place, it inevitably carries the energy of defense, an energy that leaves even our greatest achievements permeated with tension. Consider a man who spends his entire life pursuing wealth, not because he truly loves his work, but because deep within him lives a child who was once humiliated for growing up in poverty. He does not know what he is trying to prove. He only knows that stopping makes him feel empty, weak, and worthless. He cannot remain still because stillness would force him to hear the voice he has suppressed for so many years. I only wanted to be acknowledged. The more he avoids that voice, the more desperately he throws himself outward in an attempt to fill it. This is how the wounded ego operates. It compels us to act in order to escape ourselves. Carl Jung pointed out that in order to adapt to the world, we often put on a persona, a remarkably skillful social mask. But the tragedy begins when the conscious ego becomes completely identified with that mask, causing us to lose contact with the deepest truth within ourselves. Whenever that comfort zone is threatened through rejection, failure, or loss of control, the ego immediately responds with defense or attack. We rush to do something simply to cover over the emptiness that has begun to reveal itself, sending messages to a former partner to escape the fear of abandonment, burying ourselves in work to avoid uncertainty, or displaying exaggerated positivity on social media merely to prove that everything is fine. Yet, every impulsive action born from fear and old wounds only pushes us farther away from our authentic self. Acting from the wounded ego is like trying to row a boat through a violent storm. The harder you struggle, the more exhausted you become. Stillness, by contrast, the very thing we usually fear, becomes the doorway to the restructuring of the unconscious. Jung believed that stillness is the moment when we stop running, stop acting merely to conceal what lies beneath, and dare to look directly at the places we have always avoided. Not to analyze them, but to feel them. Within that state, something remarkable happens. The unconscious begins to heal itself. Just as the surface of water becomes clear only when it is no longer disturbed, the mind becomes clear only when it is no longer constantly driven by the ego. It is precisely when we do nothing that our inner energy begins to restructure itself. Many people mistake stillness for emptiness, yet stillness is movement on a deeper level, where the unconscious is quietly reorganizing the inner world. I remember a story that once spread widely across social media. A young entrepreneur sought the help of a psychoanalyst because he felt lost, despite being extraordinarily successful. He explained that he could not stop working because whenever he did, he felt as though I were dying. The therapist did not advise him simply to rest. Instead, he instructed him to sit quietly every morning for 5 minutes, without a phone, without thinking, simply breathing and sensing his own presence. At first, he could not tolerate it. He confessed, "I feel empty and useless whenever I have to face my own thoughts." Yet after several weeks, he began noticing that something was stirring within that silence. old memories, fears, guilt, and eventually a profound truth. He had never truly lived for himself. He had lived only to prove his worth. From that moment forward, he gradually stopped racing, choosing instead to devote himself to what felt genuinely meaningful and authentic. For the first time in his life, he was no longer acting from the wounded ego, but from wholeness. Stillness is not neglect. It is the courage to refrain from acting when that action is nothing more than a reaction. In analytical psychology, Jung described this as the space between impulse and response. Within that pause, a person becomes free from the compulsions of the ego and reconnects with what Jung called the self, the deepest and most authentic aspect of their being. When action arises from this place, it is no longer a reaction. It becomes the natural expression of inner wisdom. To put it more simply, the wounded ego resembles a driver gripping the steering wheel with desperate force because they are terrified of losing control. The self is different. It knows when to turn, when to stop, and when to allow the road itself to guide the journey. Actions arising from the ego always reveal the same qualities: urgency, tension, and an overwhelming need for control. Actions arising from the self are calm and natural, like a step that never tries to walk, yet moves forward effortlessly. Within modern culture, where speed has become something almost sacred, doing nothing is often regarded as weakness. Jung would have argued precisely the opposite. Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living. Talking is often a torment for me, and I need many days of silence to recover. Only within silence does the unconscious find the space to restore itself. When you sit quietly and allow your pain to rise to the surface, you are giving your inner system permission to restructure itself. During that process, old patterns gradually dissolve, repetitive cycles weaken, reactive behaviors fade, and motivations driven by fear begin to lose their hold. From the perspective of modern neuroscience, this is entirely plausible. As levels of stress activation decrease, the brain enters conditions that are more favorable for relaxation, association, and the processing of inner experience. This helps explain why certain insights or creative ideas often emerge only after people stop forcing themselves to think. Stillness does not destroy energy. It restructures energy. Eventually, you begin to realize something profoundly important. Much of what we call action is actually nothing more than a chain reaction triggered by old wounds. When we stop reacting, we do not lose our vitality. We rediscover it. When we no longer need to prove ourselves, creativity begins. When we no longer need to defend ourselves, genuine connection begins. For that reason, refraining from acting through the wounded ego is not passivity. It is action on a deeper level, where you are no longer guided by fear, but by awareness. When you become still enough to recognize your true motivations, every decision naturally becomes more appropriate, without unnecessary effort. Ultimately, as Jung once said, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Within that silence, when you no longer act in order to compensate, the world begins to move once again around you, not because of what you have done, but because you have returned to yourself. Number 2. Within stillness, the archetypes truly begin to speak. Once we learn to stop acting from the wounded ego, A new space opens within us, free from noise, free from reaction, free from the need to prove anything. This is stillness, a state that many people fear because they mistake it for emptiness, when in reality it is the birthplace of a deeper order. For when the noise of the ego subsides, something extraordinary happens. The archetypes within the unconscious begin to speak. Carl Jung believed that within every human being exists a living system of symbols, archetypes that are not merely ideas, but currents of psychic energy representing the very structure of the human soul. They are the DNA of the soul, the primordial language through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness. When the mind is excessively busy and overwhelmed by noise, we cannot hear their call. But when we enter stillness, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of awareness, those archetypes begin to emerge, as though the soul were speaking once again to itself. In everyday life, this reveals itself in subtle ways. When you sit quietly and no longer attempt to do something, images, emotions, and memories that seem entirely unrelated begin to surface. A recurring dream, a symbol that repeatedly appears in your mind, a powerful feeling that defies explanation. Many dismiss these experiences as random products of the imagination, but for Jung, they are evidence that the unconscious is reorganizing itself, sending messages through archetypal images in order to guide you closer to your authentic self. He wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, "The symbols of the self arise in the depths of the unconscious and appear as guides, warning us, correcting us, leading us back to the path. Within stillness, this becomes clearer than ever before. Symbols that once seemed vague gradually begin to acquire their own language." A woman once shared that throughout the depression following her divorce, she felt nothing except emptiness. Yet during meditation, she repeatedly saw the image of a she-wolf standing alone in the snow. At first, she believed it was merely imagination. But after reading Jung, she discovered that the symbol of the wolf is often associated with the archetype of the wild mother, representing protective energy, instinct, and the power of rebirth. As she gradually understood the symbol, she began feeling stronger, more natural, and more deeply connected with her primordial feminine instincts. Stillness did not cause her to lose her way. It led her back to the very center of an instinct she had long forgotten. This is precisely what Jung meant when he spoke of dialoguing with the unconscious. Within stillness, we do not listen with the ears, but through symbolic intuition. Archetypes do not speak through words. They communicate through images, sensations, rhythms, and lived experiences. Sometimes we call this intuition, an inner calling, or the guidance of the universe. Yet in essence, it is the collective unconscious expressing itself through the universal patterns shared by humanity. Think about a moment when you stood before an important decision. Usually you analyze, compare, and weigh every possibility. Yet there are moments when you simply know, without reasons or arguments. That is the moment when an archetype speaks. The sage within whispers that you should wait. The hero urges you that the time has come to move forward. The lover reminds you to trust connection. The shadow reminds you that this very fear is the doorway. When you become still enough to listen, every direction is already present. Within stillness, we begin to recognize the true storyteller of our lives. It is no longer the ego, but the soul itself. Every image, every dream, every emotion suddenly becomes a symbol, within a language understood only by the soul. Jung referred to this process as active imagination, the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious through symbols and imagery. Within profound stillness, this process unfolds naturally, without force. What is particularly fascinating is that modern neuroscience is gradually confirming what Jung sensed more than a century ago. When human beings enter states of deep contemplative stillness, such as meditation, the brain's default mode network, responsible for autobiographical processing and self-reflection, begins functioning differently. Brain regions associated with intuition, creativity, and primordial emotion become more strongly interconnected. In other words, the brain does not stop working during stillness. It reorganizes itself. Just like the unconscious, it reconnects seemingly separate parts of ourselves into a new structure that is more unified and more profound. For Jung, stillness does not mean stopping thought. It means changing who is speaking. When the ego becomes silent, the unconscious finds its voice. When reason becomes quiet, the soul begins to speak. But to hear it, we must learn to endure silence, something the modern world often treats as a luxury. For stillness forces us to confront the very voices we have tried to deny: fear, loneliness, and the feeling of not being enough. Yet it is precisely by remaining with those voices, instead of fleeing from them, that we open the doorway to the psychological depth Jung called the self. Someone once asked Jung, "Do you believe that people can hear the voice of their own soul?" He replied, "It is not that they cannot hear it, but that they cannot endure the silence necessary to hear it." Here we begin to understand that stillness is not an escape from action. It is the foundation of conscious action. Only when the archetypes truly begin to speak do we know what we must do, not through blind instinct, but through guidance arising from the deepest layer of the soul. If the previous section taught us not to act from our wounds, this section teaches us to act from symbols. Symbols are the map of the unconscious. They are the language through which the universe speaks to us. And we can read that map only when the mind becomes quiet enough to perceive the symbols emerging within the silence. Stillness is never empty. It is filled with life unfolding in ways that reason cannot control. When you sit quietly and feel the silence within your heart, you may not know what is happening, but the unconscious does. It is rearranging you. It is reconnecting the archetypes. It is patiently untangling the knots within your mind in order to restore inner order. This is why Jung said, "Whoever speaks in primordial images speaks with 1,000 voices." Only within stillness can we truly hear that language. Not through the ears, not through reason, but through profound presence. When we stop trying to understand, everything gradually becomes clear. When we stop speaking, the soul begins to tell its story. That is the moment when the archetypes truly begin to speak, not to command us, but to remind us that we have never truly left the current of the self. We had only forgotten how to listen. If, at this moment, you realize that today's reflections have offered you a meaningful pause and helped you discover a measure of stillness amid the relentless busyness of life, leave a like as a quiet expression of appreciation for your own journey of transformation. And if you are curious to discover which archetype is quietly calling from the deepest level of your unconscious right now, leave a single English word in the comments that reflects that energy, such as the hero, the shadow, the sage, or simply stillness. That small trace will become a floating lantern, released into the shared current of a community of souls, making their way back to the self. Thank you for your wholehearted presence. Part 4. Accepting the shadow, not to fight it, but to reconcile with it. Sometimes, what exhausts you is not that life is too harsh, but that you have spent too many years fighting against a part of yourself. You want to let go of fear, yet the more you drive it away, the more it returns. You try to become someone who is always strong, always positive, and always in control of everything. But the moment even a minor event occurs, everything collapses in an instant. This leads many people to believe that they are still too weak or have not tried hard enough. Yet from Carl Jung's perspective, the problem has never been a lack of willpower. What truly binds human beings is the endless war against the part of themselves they refuse to acknowledge. Jung called this rejected part the shadow. Many people mistakenly believe that the shadow consists only of negative qualities such as anger, selfishness, or envy. In reality, the shadow is far broader. It includes every emotion, need, and instinct that the ego believes should not exist. It may be the fear of abandonment, the feeling of not being good enough, the need to be loved, the desire to be acknowledged, or the insecurity that constantly drives a person to prove their worth. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This statement does not encourage people to immerse themselves in darkness. It emphasizes that whatever remains unseen will continue to direct life silently from behind the scenes. This is also the greatest paradox of the shadow. What you deny does not disappear. It simply withdraws from the light of consciousness and continues operating in silence. A person who constantly insists that they do not need recognition may sometimes suffer the most when they are ignored. Someone who always appears independent may be the person who fears abandonment most deeply. Someone who never stops controlling everything is often the person most unsettled by the feeling of losing control. Outwardly, they appear to be directing their lives. Inwardly, it is the shadow that is holding the steering wheel. The danger lies in the fact that they do not even realize they are being guided by the very thing they continually deny. Imagine the shadow as the silhouette behind you on a bright afternoon. The more you try to run away from it, the more it runs with you. The more you turn your back on it, the more closely it follows every step. Only when you stop and turn around to look at the ground do you realize that the shadow never intended to chase you. It is simply an inseparable part of who you are. The shadow operates according to the same principle. The more you resist it, the more energy you consume. The more you attempt to eliminate it, the more it finds other, subtler ways to appear. This explains why so many seemingly irrational behaviors repeat themselves throughout life. One person continually chooses relationships that cause pain, even though they always promise themselves that they will never allow it to happen again. Another person unconsciously delays or sabotages every opportunity whenever they come close to success. On the surface, the story appears to be about poor decisions. At a deeper level, however, the shadow is protecting an old belief that the person has never dared to confront. It is not the circumstance that keeps them trapped. It is the rejected part of the self that silently restrains every step forward. I remember Sarah, an energetic strategy manager in New York, who was known for her rational approach and flawless plans. During meetings, Sarah always maintained a calm demeanor, until one day, a young employee used a pencil to underline a figure on her slide and asked, "Is this figure truly objective?" At that moment, Sarah's expression hardened. She interrupted in a sharp voice and turned the discussion into an accusation concerning the employee's attitude and competence. The subsequent personnel evaluation described Sarah's behavior as excessively defensive, but only her therapist understood that what had triggered her outburst was never the figure itself. It was the feeling that her competence was being questioned, a feeling that had once driven her into profound isolation during adolescence under the harsh demands of her family. Every skeptical question from a colleague, even one offered with the best professional intentions, unconsciously reactivated the defense mechanism of a child who had once been forced to strain every nerve to prove her own worth. This is also why Jung did not regard the shadow as an enemy. He saw it as a forgotten part of the psyche that continually seeks to return to consciousness. The shadow does not appear in order to destroy a person, but to ask to be heard. Every time you feel envy, fear, the need to control, or despair, the shadow is not telling you that you are a bad person. It is pointing toward a part within you that still lacks acceptance. The harder you try to silence that signal, the louder the knocking becomes. The more calmly you listen, the more clearly you recognize that behind every intense emotion lies a deeply human need waiting to be named correctly. In Greek mythology, Orpheus had to descend into the underworld to find Eurydice. What is significant is that the journey did not begin with victory, but with the courage to enter the darkest place. This image carries symbolic meaning that closely resembles Jung's thought. Every person has their own underworld, a place where unwanted emotions are stored. To cross that threshold, the first step is not to take up a weapon and destroy the darkness, but to remain calm enough to stay with it. Only when darkness is no longer treated as an enemy does a person stop turning their entire life into a battlefield. This is also where many people misunderstand the meaning of letting go. They believe that letting go means forcing themselves to forget the pain, rushing themselves into forgiveness, or denying every negative emotion. In truth, this is still a form of resistance. You cannot let go of something that you are still trying desperately to drive away. Just as you cannot make water still by continually stirring it, you cannot find peace by beginning another war against your own emotions. The shadow does not require you to agree with every reaction it produces. It asks only to be seen without condemnation. For this reason, the deeper meaning of do nothing in this section is not to abandon your goals or accept living with fear forever. What must stop is the immediate reflex to fight back whenever the shadow appears. Allow fear to be named accurately. Allow feelings of inferiority, the need to be loved, and the desire for recognition to step out of the darkness without disguising themselves behind other masks. From that very moment, a conflict that has lasted for years begins to lose its reason for existing. In the end, you will realize that what truly prevents a person from letting go has never been the circumstance, nor the goal ahead. What keeps you trapped is the relentless attempt to destroy the part of yourself that you believe is unworthy of existence. The shadow does not need to be defeated. It needs to be recognized, It does not need to be erased. It needs to be reconciled. And sometimes, the most powerful action a person can take is not to continue fighting, but to end the war against the darkness within. Part 5. From an obsessed subject to an autonomous personality. When you courageously illuminate and reconcile with the darkness within, a profound transformation begins to unfold. The energy once consumed by fear starts returning to you. Darkness becomes a wise guide, while the wounds of the past become gateways to deeper wisdom. You no longer panic and reject yourself, but begin reclaiming and fully inhabiting your entire being. It is precisely at this point of integration that a new chapter begins. You completely step out of the role of a victim controlled by the unconscious and become a conscious navigator of your own life. This is the journey from a repressed subject to an autonomous personality, a person no longer manipulated by invisible impulses or fears, but calmly living from the still center of the self. If you are walking this path of reclaiming your sacred inner power, subscribe or leave a comment to affirm your presence. In this way, the Jungian stories that follow may continue to connect with you and accompany you when the time is truly ripe. Number 1. To stop pursuing is to stop defining yourself through lack. We live in a society that worships busyness, where achieving more is treated as the only measure of existence. Yet Carl Jung would point out that this relentless rushing is not the instinct to rise, but the symptom of a fractured soul. When you live under the destructive obsession called "I am still not enough," every effort, no matter how brilliant, is still powered by the energy of lack. Anything that blossoms from roots of deficiency will eventually bear the bitter fruit of anxiety and unease. Deep within the unconscious, every time you strain yourself to obtain more, the mind silently whispers a painful confession. Because you believe you are nothing, you must keep trying to fill yourself. The ego survives through comparison. It feels real only when it stands against something opposite to itself, a goal to conquer, another person to surpass, or a dazzling future to cling to. It does not know how simply to be present. It only knows how to become. Yet, as Jung observed, no awakening can occur without pain. That pain appears at the moment you suddenly realize that the exhausting race you have been running is precisely what has pulled you farthest away from yourself. From the perspective of depth psychology, the state of constant pursuit reflects an unintegrated ego, a fragile personality that must borrow external goals in order to feel valuable. Because it does not know who it is, it has no choice but to cling to labels such as successful, useful, or worthy of love. Every achievement becomes a temporary painkiller that briefly soothes an invisible fear, the fear that if you stop, you will become anonymous, empty, and insignificant. Remember that it is precisely at the moment you release this attachment, when you dare to face the feeling of being no one, that genuine autonomy begins to emerge. This paradox is clearly reflected in the story of Jim Carrey, who once stood at the summit of Hollywood fame and was celebrated around the world as a symbol of success, yet became a painful example of the tragedy of endless striving. At a BAFTA event in 2014, he shared a statement that awakened millions of people. He said that he believed everyone should become rich and famous and achieve everything they had ever dreamed of, so that they could discover for themselves that it was not the answer. Jim Carrey acknowledged that the most successful period of his career was also the time when he fell into the depths of depression. He was exhausted, not because of the work itself, but because he had to keep performing a character called Jim Carrey. Viewed through a Jungian lens, Carrey represents the image of an ego obsessed with deficiency. We often romanticize this as ambition, but in truth, it is fear skillfully disguised. When inner wounds remain unhealed, we easily confuse movement with growth. We believe that we must reach a certain milestone in order to feel whole, without realizing that the feeling of not being enough is secretly directing our entire life. We carefully construct an entire belief system around that inner emptiness and deceive ourselves by calling it motivation. Yet for Jung, nothing is more dangerous than a person acting through the energy of unresolved pain. This is the decisive boundary between the process of individuation, the process of becoming oneself, and the toxic inflation of the ego. A person undergoing individuation lives from the self, a still center that does not need to prove anything, but simply expresses itself naturally. By contrast, a person consumed by ego inflation lives inside an illusion where every action is a defensive reaction to perceived lack. The difference does not lie in what they do, but in the quality of energy behind the action. Two people may pursue the same project, yet one acts from inherent wholeness, while the other acts to fill an inner emptiness. As a result, the psychological outcomes they experience are completely different. This applies to every area of life, from work and money to knowledge. Every frantic race to acquire more contains a silent confession that something is missing. By contrast, when a person begins to recognize that they are already whole, the energy of compulsive pursuit naturally transforms into pure creative energy. You no longer create value in order to demand recognition. You create simply because expressing your being brings joy. Jung once taught that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down into hell. Only when you stop rushing outward to collect fragments of borrowed value do you truly awaken. At that point, action is no longer a panicked reaction to fear, but the natural movement of the self. This is not a call to abandon ambition or surrender to passivity. It is an invitation to pause and ask where your actions are coming from. If you work from the joy of creation, that is the voice of the soul. But if you labor only because you fear being forgotten or looked down upon, then you are being controlled by an ego covered in scars. To stop pursuing does not mean abandoning your dreams. It means abandoning the illusion that you can become whole only after obtaining something outside yourself. When that illusion dissolves, you no longer need achievement in order to feel valuable, because your very presence already possesses intrinsic worth. And at the very moment you release this attachment, a remarkable paradox unfolds. Everything you once desperately chased begins returning to its rightful place. Number 2. Reconnecting with the authentic self. When you stop defining yourself through lack and end the endless pursuit of becoming someone, another doorway opens naturally, the doorway of return. No longer frantically chasing success, love, or illusions of fame, the soul begins the journey of reconnecting with what Carl Jung called the true self. This is the quiet, lucid, and autonomous core within every person, a sacred inner space that is not shaped by society, fear, or ambition. If the previous stage involved stopping in order to disconnect from the energy of compensation, then this stage is the journey home. the remembrance that we were whole from the beginning. Carl Jung believed that deep within every human being exists a center of wholeness called the self, where the fragmented elements of consciousness and the unconscious are integrated into one. Yet, to reach the self, we must pass through the fog of the false ego, also known as the social persona. From childhood, people learn to reshape themselves in exchange for acceptance from those around them. They must be obedient, accomplished, strong, and always positive. These adaptations are not inherently wrong, but wearing the mask for too long gradually causes us to forget the true face behind the role. When the persona consumes the entire identity, we become identified with the mask and painfully spend our lives performing a role instead of living from our authentic being. From the perspective of depth psychology, reconnection begins only when we stop running from our inner world and courageously initiate a dialogue with it. Jung called this active imagination, a method in which people do not merely observe, but directly converse with the images, emotions, and symbols that rise from the unconscious. Within this encounter, the authentic self gradually reveals itself, not through thunderous voices or dramatic revelations, but as a feeling of stillness, clarity, and certainty that reason cannot fully explain. This awakening is clearly reflected in the journey of Oprah Winfrey, who once described her life as a prolonged struggle between the voice of the world and the voice of the soul. During a talk at Stanford University, she shared that she had spent many years trying to become the woman society expected her to be, someone capable of doing everything. Yet the turning point came only when she painfully realized that trying to be everything for everyone meant having nothing left for herself. That was the moment when the persona began to break apart and the voice of the soul emerged. Oprah chose to withdraw into stillness, devoting time to meditation, journaling, and the practice of listening. She came to understand that deep within every human being there is always a voice whispering the truth. It is always present, but it can only be heard when the mind becomes completely still. Through a Jungian lens, that moment marks the activation of the self. When we release the pressure to become someone, the authentic self naturally rises, just as a seed can germinate only when the soil is no longer being frantically disturbed. When the authentic self speaks, it does not need to prove itself or shout. It simply knows the truth. Reconnecting with the authentic self does not mean rejecting the real world. It means severing dependence on social roles. You continue to work, love, and create value, but you no longer operate through fear or compensatory ambition. You fulfill the responsibilities of life with the spirit of a free participant, serious yet unattached, devoted yet never enslaved. This is the essence of individuation, the state in which the soul reaches a profound balance between light and darkness, consciousness and the unconscious, action and being. Yet philosophical understanding alone is not enough, because as Jung once taught, knowing something is one thing, becoming it is another. Becoming requires direct, lived experience. Reconnection is not an abstract concept, but a slow, profound, and demanding practice. It does not ask you to add more actions. Instead, it invites you to remove layers of disguise so that you can listen to the most subtle movements within. The first step is the art of intentional stillness. Each day, set aside a few minutes simply to sit quietly without practicing any meditation technique or forcing yourself into calmness. When inner resistance appears through thoughts such as, "I am wasting time," or "I need to do something else immediately," recognize that this is the ego panicking because it fears losing control within silence. Instead of resisting or suppressing it, simply smile, observe, and continue remaining present. Sitting still with yourself without escaping is the first declaration of autonomy. As stillness gradually opens, the next step is to become aware of the source of your actions. Before making a decision, sending an email, or reacting during an argument, pause for a moment and ask yourself, which part of me is performing this action? Is it the ego that fears judgment and wants to prove its worth? Or is it the clear inner center expressing the truth? This awareness helps you distinguish reactions arising from wounds from choices arising from the self, allowing energy to shift from instinctive reaction toward conscious direction. At a deeper level of practice, you may use journaling as a form of inner dialogue. When intense emotions such as anger, anxiety, or conflict arise, write as though you are speaking directly with the emotion itself. Allow intuition to speak instead of using reason to filter or judge. Gradually, you will recognize that these emotional aspects are not fighting against you. They are simply longing to be heard. The authentic self is the silent space that observes all these voices without condemnation. To strengthen this process, try practicing a day without masks. Choose one day each week to allow yourself to live with complete honesty. If you are tired, admit that you are tired. If you do not know something, calmly say that you do not know. If you feel uncomfortable, acknowledge the discomfort without punishing yourself. When you release the obligation to appear perfect or composed in front of others, you begin to recognize that the authentic self does not need to struggle in order to be loved. It only needs permission to exist. This reconnection cannot happen overnight. It requires the patience of tending an inner garden. The greatest challenge of human life is daring to live truthfully as yourself in a world that is constantly rushing to imitate others. Whenever you find yourself pulled into comparison or the fear of judgment, pause and remind yourself that you do not need to become anyone else. You only need to return to yourself. When observation, stillness, and dialogue are practiced continuously, a remarkable truth begins to reveal itself. You do not need to struggle to reconnect because you were never truly separated from the authentic self. It has always been there, patiently waiting for you to become still enough to recognize it. At this point, every concept of self-development or self-discovery becomes unnecessary because you have become a state of complete awareness. There is no grand ritual and no summit to conquer. There is only one form of courage, the courage to remain with yourself when there is nothing left to cling to. From that moment onward, every thought, word, and action begins to radiate the energy of a soul that has finally found its way home. Part 6. Only when you need nothing does everything begin to find you. After passing through the turning point of reconnecting with the authentic self, a quiet yet profoundly significant shift immediately begins within the field of inner energy. The persistent sense of lack completely dissolves, giving way to a state of calm and inner freedom. Strangely, it is precisely when we stop desperately clinging to or forcing anything that everything in life gradually begins to shift and find its way back to us. This is not a mysterious form of magic, but a natural principle of depth psychology, one that Carl Jung expressed in the classic statement, What you resist not only persists, but grows in size. What you try hardest to force will often escape you. By contrast, what you learn to release, receive calmly, and welcome in stillness will begin to find its way to you on its own. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche operates through a process of self-regulation, much like a natural ecosystem. Everything naturally returns to its optimal state of balance once it is no longer disturbed by the unreasonable interference of the ego. When the inner world is freed from unnecessary friction, the outer world becomes an honest mirror, fully reflecting the new order that has been established within. This remarkable phenomenon is closely connected with the concept of synchronicity, which refers to events that share no direct physical relationship of cause and effect, yet unfold meaningfully at precisely the right moment when a person releases narrow control and reconnects deeply with the self. As Jung once observed, we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. A modern illustration of this principle can be found in the life of actor Keanu Reeves. After enduring profound tragedies, from losing loved ones to experiencing instability in his career, he chose a quiet and contemplative way of life, remaining outside Hollywood's frantic pursuit of fame. During one personal reflection, he reportedly shared, "I am at peace with my life. If everything ends tomorrow, that is still all right. I have stopped chasing. What is meant for me will find me." Once he released the need to prove his worth through the spotlight, his career found its way back to him with greater brilliance and longevity than ever through the John Wick film franchise, which portrayed the image of a calm, profound, and inwardly complete man. From the perspective of neuropsychology, the state of needing nothing marks the moment when the impulses of the unconscious and consciousness reach a point of profound balance. The human brain reaches its greatest ability to recognize genuine opportunities only when it is completely freed from the panic of perceived lack. When you stop needing and stop sending out signals of fear, stress hormones cease to dominate, intuition becomes unusually sharp, and you naturally become more magnetic. Not because you are straining to attract anything, but because you are resonating with the original current of life. Carl Jung compared this process to the growth of a seed beneath the soil. The seed never panics in its effort to become a great tree. It simply passes patiently through the darkness, waits for the right moment, and allows the life within it to break through naturally. Only when the ego releases control does the self truly have the space to speak. However, the state of needing nothing does not mean indifference or abandoning responsibility toward life. It is the highest form of inner freedom, a state in which you continue to devote yourself fully without becoming attached to or tormented by the outcome. Jung once emphasized, "Fidelity to the law of your own being is an act of high courage flung in the face of life." In everyday life, this transformation begins by quietly recognizing the motives behind your needs. The need to be acknowledged, the need to be understood, or the need to possess. The moment these motives are illuminated by awareness, panic loses its power to control you. You continue doing the same work, but from an entirely different state of mind. Instead of acting from the belief, "I need this in order to feel valuable," you gently shift toward the understanding, "I am already whole, and this is how I share that wholeness with the world." One of the most profound pieces of wisdom Carl Jung left to humanity is this: we do not solve our problems, we grow out of them. When you are no longer obsessed with achieving something in order to feel complete, you do not need to exhaust your mind trying to destroy or erase the problem. Instead, your awareness expands until you become greater than the problem itself. This phenomenon reflects a principle of depth psychology that Jung associated with the reversal of opposites. When a particular state of energy is pushed to its absolute limit, it naturally transforms into its opposite. Only when you courageously release the need to control reality do you truly become the center from which your own life is directed. The essential lesson is this: something truly belongs to us only when we no longer use it as a tool for defining our worth. You do not need a prestigious social position or the approval of others to prove that you exist. Upon reaching this state of autonomy, a person no longer pursues or accumulates endlessly, but simply becomes fully present in every moment. You begin naturally drawing the most suitable opportunities and relationships into your life, not because you are tirelessly chasing them, but because your being is expressing the true frequency of original wholeness. When you need nothing, you do not lose your life. You finally become one with its immense current, where everything good naturally settles into the place where it has always belonged. Part 7. Time and Emptiness. This is the moment when everything appears to stand still, without movement and without revelation. Yet within that stillness, life is quietly weaving the structure of our being anew. There is no sound, no light, only time and emptiness, the sacred space where faith is tested and where the ripening of the soul unfolds in silence. Number 1. The delay between the state of having and manifested reality is a test of faith. After a person learns to stop desperately needing anything in order to feel whole, a subtler and more demanding challenge immediately begins: the challenge of time. When we reach the state of having, the state of unwavering faith, complete presence, and profound connection with the self, physical reality does not instantly transform before our eyes. There is always a delay, sometimes painfully long, between the quiet transformation within and its corresponding manifestation in the material world. This delay is the sacred testing ground through which every person must pass in order to grow beyond themselves, rather than rushing to shorten or force it. In the language of Jungian psychology, the unconscious does not operate according to the linear time of reason. Consciousness measures life through hours, days, months, and years. But the unconscious moves according to symbolic time, where every transformation unfolds through natural cycles and the maturation of the soul rather than the rhythm of a wristwatch. The ego, accustomed to control and manipulation, always demands immediate results. It requires evidence. It frantically searches for confirmation that says, "I have done the right thing." Yet the self never responds to such coercive demands. It tests the individual through silence. And within that vast silence, we are pushed into the stage Jung described as the extreme tension between what is already known and what is quietly taking shape. This is precisely the period in which many people feel most disoriented and alone. They have undergone profound inner transformation, yet the outer world has not caught up. They have released attachment, learned to trust, and worked tirelessly to heal their wounds. But the dream job has not arrived, sincere love has not appeared, and life seems frozen within a frightening silence. During this desolate period, the ego begins whispering poisonous doubts. What if I was wrong? What if all of this is nothing more than self-deception? Yet the delay is not punishment or stagnation. It is the stage in which faith is strengthened and refined. It resembles a seed that has cracked open after resting in moist soil, yet continues to remain patiently beneath the earth, rather than immediately rising toward the sunlight. A wise farmer understands that such silence is part of the natural process of life. Only the hurried modern mind cannot endure the waiting, and in its panic begins digging up the very soil in which the soul is taking root. Jung emphasized that every authentic psychological transformation must pass through an alchemical nigredo, a state of darkness, emptiness, and apparent fruitlessness. In the ancient spiritual art of alchemy, this stage was essential. Raw material had to endure intense heat, melt, and completely disintegrate before it could be transformed into pure gold. The unconscious also requires this period of stillness in order to restructure symbols, transform energy, and clear away archetypes that have become outdated. If we attempt to force the result to appear too soon, we interrupt the natural process and push ourselves back into the old repetitive cycle. The delay has never been meaningless time. It is the most sacred space of transformation. Consider a familiar example from the modern world, where fame and recognition often arrive far earlier than inner maturity. We live in an age of early success, where young people of 16 or 17 can suddenly become global stars, gain millions of followers, accumulate enormous wealth, and stand beneath dazzling lights that illuminate their every move. Yet behind that brilliance, a familiar tragedy repeatedly unfolds. They collapse. This collapse does not arise from a lack of talent, but because their inner world has not yet developed enough depth and maturity to carry the weight of the outer world. The world has witnessed countless young singers, actors, and athletes reach the summit of glory at an early age, only to fall rapidly into psychological crisis, addiction, depression, and complete disorientation. They entered manifested reality too quickly before their souls had the necessary interval in which to become. Through a Jungian lens, they are living inside an excessively inflated persona, a grand mask nourished by external praise, while behind it remains a wounded child struggling to discover who they truly are. The delay Jung refers to is the vital interval needed for a person to realign and synchronize with themselves after every major leap in life. If the soul is not allowed to rest and withdraw into stillness in order to reshape its inner system, it will automatically trigger psychological crises or external disruptions that force us to stop. This is why many people suddenly retreat into silence after reaching the height of success, as though the universe were delivering a stern message. Stop. Your soul has not yet reached that place. Passing through the delay requires unwavering faith, but this is not blind belief or baseless illusion. It is faith built upon direct experience of the authentic self. It is the certainty that I am already whole, even when no material result has appeared to prove it. It is trust that a greater order is operating quietly, even though limited reason cannot yet perceive or touch it. Jung called this faith in the individuation process. No one can use a technique to shorten this process. We can only pass through it courageously with complete awareness. In reality, many people collapse and give up precisely at this stage because they mistake the silence of the universe for personal failure. Yet someone who has traveled through the Jungian journey understands that every moment in which it appears that nothing is happening is often the very moment when everything is unfolding most deeply and intensely. Behind the curtain of consciousness, the unconscious is quietly restructuring the entire system of inner energy, redirecting old archetypes and preparing the conditions for a new reality to be born. Like an unborn child within the womb, no one can see life forming day by day. But when the moment is ripe, that life will cry out into the world without any need for force. The delay is the ultimate test of surrender. It is the period in which you continue making effort without forcing an answer, and face uncertainty calmly without allowing fear to control you. When the time is ripe, the result will reveal itself naturally as a consequence of inner maturity. We are not granted something new. We have simply developed enough inner capacity to receive it. When you move through the delay without losing faith, you do not merely obtain what you desire, you become completely free from waiting itself. You understand that life is still unfolding perfectly according to the rhythm of the soul, rather than the impatient clock of the ego. The delay has never been merely the distance between a dream and reality. It is the sacred ground where the soul tests whether you have developed enough maturity, depth, and stability to live with what you once prayed for. When you can stand firmly within that space, without despair, without impatience, simply present and trusting, what you seek is no longer a distant destination that must arrive. It is already there, present within the wisdom of your patience. Number 2. Doing nothing is an act of courage from a maturing soul. After a person has courageously passed through the stage in which reality has not yet manifested, the most difficult challenge is not merely enduring ordinary waiting. It is learning to endure vast silence without frantically rushing into action simply to escape uncertainty. The ego always demands immediate action, because action gives it the illusion that it still possesses control and is actively directing life. Yet the soul, guided by deeper wisdom, understands a different law. There are moments in history when every forced action arising from fear becomes the greatest obstacle, while calm stillness becomes the highest expression of maturity. This is the crucial stage Carl Jung described through the concept of suspension of the will. The moment when personal will must consciously step back so that the self can take over and guide the process of life. From the earliest days of entering society, people are conditioned to believe that they must do something to change their fate, that they must constantly move forward and never stop striving. Frantic action becomes a new religion, while stillness and release are negatively labeled as stagnation, laziness, or failure. Jung, however, with the sharp perception of a depth psychologist, understood that sometimes doing nothing is the only way to avoid destroying the inner achievements that are quietly beginning to blossom. The unconscious cannot be forced to ripen through coercive actions imposed by consciousness. It can only be allowed to reveal itself freely when the moment has truly matured. In order to grow beyond itself, the human soul requires a space of complete silence, where every crude intervention of consciousness comes to a halt, and the natural process is allowed to unfold freely. Within Jungian therapy, Moments that appear to show no external progress are often the deepest psychological turning points. These are the moments when the patient stops struggling, stops frantically demanding instant solutions, and simply sits quietly with themselves. Jung described this state as alchemical stillness, the sacred space where the unconscious begins to restructure and clear away energy that has been compressed for many years. Within this profound stillness, rejected aspects of identity begin to be recognized, wounds from the past begin to soften, and core values that seemed lost begin to return on their own. Within the frantic rhythm of modern society, choosing to do nothing becomes a revolutionary and courageous act. The world constantly demands that we react immediately to every stimulus, every news item, every notification, every social media update, and every endless comparison. For an individual to slow down and refuse to react is a declaration of profound inner autonomy. Each time we force ourselves to respond hurriedly, we allow external pressure to determine the pace at which our soul develops. Jung once left behind a psychologically profound statement: "Hurry is not of the devil, it is the devil." Hurry is not merely something that leads toward darkness. Distorted haste is itself the expression of darkness. It severs the sacred connection between the individual and the calm inner current, where authentic life is actually unfolding. Observe the natural world around you and notice how irrational the human mind has become. Nature contains no frantic haste. A seed never rushes to sprout the moment it is placed into moist soil. A river never needs to accelerate wildly merely to reach the sea. The moon never strains itself to become full before its natural cycle. Every being in the universe operates patiently according to its own original rhythm. And this is why nature never falls into disorder or panic. When human beings return to their own inner rhythm, they also reach that extraordinary harmony. The state of doing nothing is not procrastination or denial of reality. It is perfect alignment with the natural law of the soul. Those who have courageously passed through the night sea journey, a symbolic motif representing passage through the darkness of the psyche, understand this lesson deeply. When we suddenly lose important foundations in life, such as a career, a loved one, or a sense of future direction, the survival instinct of the ego immediately urges us to do something in order to escape the feeling of loss. Yet harsh reality reveals that the more frantically we act in panic, the more everything falls apart. The harder we strain to control, the more chaotic reality becomes. Only when a person courageously accepts the temporary helplessness of consciousness and lets go can an entirely new field of awareness begin to open. It is within that still space that the miraculous truly appears, not because we forced action, but because we ended the violent resistance within. From the perspective of psychological and neurological science, doing nothing creates the conditions for the nervous system to return to its natural equilibrium. When we stop producing panicked defensive reactions, the brain begins shifting from the fight or flight state into a state of recovery and deep restoration. This is when blocked energy in the body begins to circulate freely, emotional intelligence is restored, and intuition, the deep voice of the self, can finally be heard clearly. A person who remains constantly trapped in the need to act will never hear what the soul is whispering, because the mind is filled with the overwhelming noise of consciousness. By contrast, the person who dares to stand still and do nothing is the one who begins hearing messages that exist beyond language. Within the creative arts, many great artists have acknowledged that their most inspired moments did not arrive when they were forcing the mind, but precisely when they surrendered and stopped. The gifted composer Claude Debussy left behind an immortal observation. Music is the silence between the notes. Jung's perspective is fully aligned with this spirit. Authentic creativity can blossom only from profound emptiness, where the ego becomes completely silent and the self begins to sing. At this moment, allow yourself a brief experience of complete stillness. Slowly soften your breathing. There is no need to make any effort, no need to analyze your thoughts. Simply breathe deeply and listen to the silence that exists between these lines. Sometimes, only when you stop trying to understand through reason do the deepest truths reveal themselves and settle into the soul. Look at yourself honestly. Whenever you enter a crisis or reach an impasse in life, your first instinct is usually to rush into action, desperately search for a solution, find a direction, or cling to someone who might save you. Yet, if you courageously stop all those chaotic reactions, you may discover a startling truth. A crisis has never needed to be solved through superficial techniques. It simply needs to be accompanied and illuminated through presence. Doing nothing does not mean neglecting life or abandoning responsibility. It means allowing everything to exist exactly as it is, including emotional confusion, emptiness, fear, uncertainty, and even temporary hopelessness. Within this space of non-judgmental acceptance, something remarkable begins to happen. When we stop desperately running from the darkness within, the light of wisdom naturally begins to rise from inside us. A powerful example of this process is the period of spiritual hibernation that many people experience during personal development. After periods of expanded awareness and significant achievement, they suddenly fall into an immense emptiness where motivation disappears, inspiration fades, and clear direction is lost. Many panic and believe they are regressing or failing. Yet from a Jungian perspective, this is an invaluable period in which the soul strengthens itself and sends its roots deeper into a new foundation. Just as soil must rest after an exhausting season of cultivation, the human soul must pass through profound silence after major transformation. If we force it to do something when it longs for rest, we create only more chaos and exhaustion within ourselves. Within Jungian philosophy, this is the true expression of spiritual maturity. A person no longer needs to react constantly or create disturbance merely to feel alive. Lived experience becomes deeper than any visible action, and the meaning of life is no longer dependent upon measurable material results. Doing nothing becomes a sacred ritual of unwavering trust. We trust that a profound transformation is unfolding within the unconscious, even when our senses and reason cannot reach it. We trust that silence is also a powerful form of action, the action of ultimate courage. When you truly learn the art of doing nothing, not from helplessness, but from trust, you discover something profound. The world has never stopped moving. Even when you are silent, the current continues. Even when you stand still, life continues moving through you. You no longer have to make life happen, because you are life happening. And this is the most courageous act of a soul that has matured. Part 8. Beneath desire lies the gateway to meaning. When human beings learn how to stand still, stop rushing to search, and cease striving to control reality, a miraculous phenomenon reveals itself. Beneath the outer shell of the pressure of desire, an entirely different source of energy emerges, one that is deeper, quieter, and filled with wisdom. Carl Jung called this source of energy meaning, an absolute value that cannot be manufactured through the force of reason, but can only reveal itself when a person has the courage to relinquish personal will. In Jungian psychology, every act driven by the desire for control originates from the needs of the ego. Meaning, by contrast, belongs to the authority of the self. Only when the ego accepts stepping into the background does the gateway leading into the world of meaning truly open. In practical life, we often confuse goals with meaning. Goals are what the ego longs to possess, measurable and linear by nature, whereas meaning is what the soul longs to express, whole and complete, and something that can only be absorbed through intuition. When the ego becomes obsessed with goals, we constantly feel as though we are straining to row against the current. Yet when we are willing to surrender control, we begin to sense the natural current of life carrying and supporting us. At that point, our way of living shifts from "I am striving to live" to "life is freely unfolding through me." Look at the rhythm of modern life. People continually torment themselves with the question, "What do I want?" Yet they rarely slow down long enough to listen to the question, "What is life seeking to express through me?" It is this second question that unlocks the dialogue with the self. It is the place where a person clearly realizes that they are not the center of the universe, entitled to make everything serve them, but rather a harmonious part of a far greater order. From that realization onward, meaning is no longer something we must relentlessly pursue or struggle to obtain from the outside world. Instead, it gradually reveals itself through the smallest experiences of everyday life. Many people truly reach the gateway to meaning only after the entire structure of their lives has completely collapsed. It is precisely at the moment when the will is exhausted and trapped in despair that they unexpectedly encounter a profound and mysterious sense of peace. Jung referred to this as a moment of grace, where the rigid structure of the ego is shattered and the self begins to speak in its original voice. We stop asking, "How can I escape this pain immediately?" and begin asking instead, "What message is this pain trying to deliver to my soul?" In numerous studies within modern psychology, researchers have demonstrated that human beings cannot sustain lasting happiness merely by continuously achieving personal goals. Each time we reach a milestone, the nervous system releases dopamine, producing only a temporary sense of exhilaration before rapidly declining and pushing us into yet another cycle of craving. By contrast, those who live with a sense of meaning consistently maintain deeper inner fulfillment and far greater psychological resilience. From the Jungian perspective, meaning is absolutely not something fabricated by the intellect, but something discovered. Life unfolds like a vast collective dream, and meaning is the hidden language through which the soul communicates with consciousness. Whenever the ego strays from its proper path, the unconscious activates a compensatory mechanism through events such as losing a job or experiencing failure in order to restore balance. Likewise, burnout, or the loss of one's soul, does not occur primarily because of excessive working hours, but because a person is acting in complete disconnection from meaning. When we genuinely come into contact with meaning, every action in life becomes remarkably graceful and effortless. You devote yourself to your work out of pure joy rather than fear of failure. You open your heart to love because it is a natural expression of your being, rather than a plea for something in return. You create because it is an instinct of existence itself, not because you need to prove your worth to anyone. From a practical standpoint, the journey toward meaning requires the capacity to listen without interfering. Whenever you encounter suffering, rather than rushing to eliminate the pain, calmly ask yourself what lesson lies behind it. Just as a raw piece of ore must submit to the intense heat of the furnace before it can be forged into a new form, human beings must inevitably pass through the dissolution of personal will before meaning can truly take shape. And this is the deepest paradox of all. The less personal will seeks to dominate, the more powerful the soul becomes. Meaning does not reside in what we stubbornly cling to, but in the way we remain fully present with every event, embracing both light and shadow, joy and sorrow, possession and loss alike. For as Carl Jung left us with his timeless declaration, "I don't aspire to be a good man, I aspire to be a whole man." When we choose to live with that spirit, will becomes a sharp instrument of action, while meaning serves as the guiding compass of the soul. In that perfect harmony, life ceases to be a series of exhausting struggles, and instead becomes a sacred and wondrous dialogue between the human being and the soul. Part 9. The State of Transformation. Number 1. You are no longer the one who longs, you are the center of natural attraction. At this stage, you have completely moved beyond the position of someone who endlessly longs for something from the external world. Instead, the whole of reality begins to move of its own accord and revolve around you. Carl Jung called this level of transformation the ultimate union with the self, the moment when the energies of the unconscious and the conscious are no longer divided or fractured by conflict, and the human being officially becomes the perfectly harmonious point of convergence between the inner and the outer, between the individual and the universe as a whole. Within this dimension of existence, you no longer need to strain yourself to attract anything, because your very being has become the sole source radiating the original frequency toward which every corresponding reality naturally returns. If, during the earlier stages of the journey, human beings had to exert themselves through willpower and desire, continually straining to achieve goals, exhausting themselves to prove their worth, or desperately attempting to control circumstances, then at this threshold, every form of coercive will naturally dissolves into the inherent magnetism of being. Jung believed that when you truly have the courage to become yourself, completely shedding your social roles and shattering every false persona, the energy circulating within you reaches its most authentic and pure frequency. At that frequency, you no longer need to labor to attract anyone or anything, because everything that corresponds with your being, from people and opportunities to profound experiences, will naturally resonate with you and return to its rightful orbit. Through the lens of Jungian depth psychology, this miraculous phenomenon is not mystical magic or spiritual illusion, but the inevitable consequence of complete inner unity. When the ego and the unconscious become one, all the psychic energy that had been fragmented and leaking away for years immediately gathers again, like a vast magnet fully charged with power. You no longer lose your vital force through resistance to reality, waves of panic and anxiety, or meaningless comparisons of superiority and inferiority. You stand firmly at the center, not because you desire to control the world, but because you have fully integrated yourself into the natural order through which life unfolds. This is the destination of the individuation process, where the soul attains a state of absolute inner sovereignty. A person who has reached the end of this journey is no longer a hopeless seeker, but has become a naturally radiant source around which all other elements willingly revolve. Imagine a small planet patiently orbiting the sun. The sun has never needed to exhaust itself chasing the planets, strain to hold them in place, or send out any desperate signal saying, "Come to me." It simply exists and shines from its own primordial nature. It is that light, that natural and enduring gravitational field, that automatically draws every planet into its proper and stable orbit. A person who has become fully united with their being functions in exactly the same way. They no longer frantically pursue love because they are the embodiment of love. They no longer tirelessly chase success because they have become a pure channel for creative energy. They no longer beg for the meaning of life because they are meaning itself, alive and fully present. This is not an abstract theory or an empty speculation, but a psychological phenomenon confirmed through lived experience. Individuals who attain a state of complete presence often possess an invisible yet extraordinarily powerful influence. They do not need to speak excessively, yet anyone who approaches them immediately senses an atmosphere of profound peace and stillness. They do not need to struggle to persuade others through reasoning, yet every word they speak carries weight and absolute credibility. They do not need to prove their competence or value, because their natural existence is already the most compelling testimony. This power has nothing to do with status, authority, or outward fame. It arises from the pure frequency of psychic energy, which Jung indicated can emerge only when consciousness and the unconscious have completely brought every conflict to an end. In everyday life, you can easily recognize this quality in people who know how to remain firmly rooted in the center of their own being. They never rush into reactions driven by panic, nor are they easily shaken or devastated by praise, admiration, judgment, or contempt from the outside world. They act with ease when the moment requires it, rest calmly when the body needs it, and speak only when their words truly bring value. A living magnetic field always radiates from such people, not the shallow appeal of outward charm, but an extraordinarily stable and grounded field of energy that makes others feel completely safe and naturally drawn to them in a way that reason cannot explain. In energy psychology, this is the ultimate magnetism of an individual who is living in their rightful place, someone who is aligned with their own original frequency. By contrast, when people remain trapped in a state of longing, they continually emit an energetic field of lack and fear. They crave love because they are terrified of empty loneliness. They hunger for success because they fear becoming meaningless. They frantically control everything because they are afraid of being hurt. Yet that very energy of fear and panic unintentionally pushes every good thing farther away, because fear can never resonate with complete freedom. When you remain in a state of longing, you are unconsciously sending a powerful signal into the universe that you have never been whole. But when you reach the state of simply being, every corresponding reality naturally returns to you, just as countless small rivers eventually flow of their own accord into the vast sea. To understand this more clearly, observe two completely opposite states of love. One person enters love through the fear of loss. They constantly control, torment themselves with anxiety, become suspicious, and strain to prove their worth. The other enters love from a state of inner sufficiency and wholeness. They share, they remain deeply present, and they offer freedom without ever needing to possess or bind. The first person creates a psychological state of contraction and suffocation. The second opens a vast and liberated field of energy. An open field of energy always possesses the highest natural magnetism. Jung would explain that the first person is acting entirely under the manipulation of the ego, while the second is operating directly from the wisdom of the self. When we act from the self, slogans such as "I love" or "I want to be loved" no longer exist. There is only pure love, freely moving and expressing itself through our being. Natural magnetism can never be manufactured or falsified. You cannot perform it or acquire it through any psychological technique, because the very act of performing is already an admission of fear and deficiency. True magnetism can only blossom when you completely relax and stop trying. This occurs when your precious energy is no longer wasted on exhausting efforts to force others to love, trust, or acknowledge you. When you cease being someone who longs, you officially become a being who exists. From that moment onward, the external world naturally returns to you, because you have become the perfect point of balance between wholehearted engagement and absolute surrender. From the perspective of depth spirituality, this is the highest state of living magnetism, where human beings no longer use raw force to compel reality or attain goals, but use complete presence to invite reality toward them. You do not force, you do not entice, you simply exist. It is precisely this authentic and flawless presence that causes everything around you to adjust and rearrange itself until it aligns perfectly with your frequency. This is no longer attraction in the ordinary transactional sense, but complete synchronization with the vast rhythm of the universe. At an even deeper level, Carl Jung would point out that this is the sign that the soul has fully transcended the dualistic cycle of opposing poles. It is no longer divided or torn between wanting and not wanting, between having and not having. When you remain firmly rooted in that silent center, you no longer have to exhaust yourself trying to reach the light, because you yourself have become the lamp through which light shines brilliantly in human form. And when this happens, everything you once exhausted yourself seeking, from love and inner peace to radiant success, is no longer something luxurious that must be begged for from the outside. It becomes the natural and inevitable expression of a soul that has attained complete harmony within. For this reason, the message, "You are no longer the one who longs," does not mean that you must abandon your dreams, aspirations, or life goals. It means that your dreams and goals no longer possess the power to manipulate or govern your peace. You no longer approach the world with the mindset of a desperate person seeking to extract or take something from it, but with the mindset of an abundant being who has come to contribute and share. You are no longer someone searching for light in the darkness. You are the one freely shining. And when that moment arrives, you do not merely attract life. you have officially become the great center around which life willingly revolves. Number 2. This way of living is not a trick for getting what you want, but a path to becoming what you are. If understood only at a superficial level, many people can easily fall into the misconception that this is simply a more effective strategy for living. They mistakenly believe that if they learn to let go, stop demanding, or practice presence, they will obtain everything the ego desires. It is precisely at this turning point that a subtle yet profoundly important correction must be made. This way of living is absolutely not a technique for getting what you want, but the only path through which you can become what you truly are. Carl Jung repeatedly issued stern warnings about the subtle trap known as the spiritual ego. When people encounter teachings about energy, the law of attraction, or the power of awareness, the ego quickly appropriates those insights to serve its old purpose, control and manipulation. It whispers calculations such as, "If I learn to need nothing, everything will come to me. If I practice stillness, I will attract a person I desire. If I learn to let go, life will become easier." You cannot use the idea of light to avoid your inner darkness, nor can you use surrender as a carefully fashioned instrument for obtaining the desires that the ego continues to crave. Jung called this spiritual bypass, a condition in which people disguise themselves in lofty concepts merely to avoid confronting reality as it truly is. For example, you say that you are learning to let go, while your mind is still silently waiting for a result. You say, "I am no longer attached," yet deep within, you still hope that what you want will find its way to you. You meditate not out of a pure love for stillness, but because you want to pressure reality into changing more quickly. The ego can wear every sophisticated mask, including the mask of awakening. And precisely when we mistakenly believe that we have transcended the ego, it may in fact be growing stronger and governing us more powerfully than ever before. Jung therefore emphasized that the essence of transformation does not lie in the question, "How can I have it?" but in the principle of becoming. When you truly become, when your energy, awareness, and even your smallest actions are fully aligned with your authentic being, then having becomes nothing more than a natural and inevitable consequence that requires no pursuit. By contrast, if you live only in order to obtain, you are still operating entirely from the frequency of lack. The paradox is this: when you act in order to gain something, you are unconsciously affirming to yourself that you do not yet possess it. The universe does not respond to polite words. The universe responds to the frequency of being. If your frequency is "I need," you will remain imprisoned in the experience of lacking. Consider a practical example: a man searching for love. He studies the law of attraction, explores masculine and feminine energy, measures vibrational frequencies, and carefully practices every principle solely to attract a relationship. Yet beneath all those techniques, his original energy still radiates one unmistakable message: "I am lonely. I need someone in order to feel complete." He may repeat positive affirmations every day, but the universe does not listen to surface words. The universe listens to who he is. As long as the pain of loneliness has not been embraced, and as long as he still expects love to arrive and fill the wounded emptiness within him, he continues to emit the signal of lack. Only when he stops seeking love in order to feel whole, and instead lives calmly as a being who is already whole? Does love naturally reveal itself? Not as a reward granted from outside, but as a truthful reflection of his inner state. The essential difference, therefore, lies entirely in the energetic motive. A person who remains in the state of wanting believes that a distance exists between themselves and what they seek. A person who has reached the state of becoming realizes that this distance never truly existed. The first person strives to act in order to cross the distance. The second simply and calmly remains present. It is precisely this pure presence that creates genuine magnetism, not the magnetism of manipulative desire, but the magnetism of essential resonance. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the ego completely surrenders to the self. Personal will is no longer misused to manipulate circumstances, but becomes a pure instrument for expressing being. When you live fully in accordance with your true nature, every action becomes natural, free from calculation and destabilizing fear. You do not meditate in order to beg for peace. You meditate because peace is already your primordial nature. You do not love in order to receive love in return. You love because the current of love is moving freely through you. You do not create in order to plead for recognition. You create because life longs to express itself through your form. In this dimension, action is no longer an exhausting effort, but becomes a state of flow, a condition in which a person is deeply focused and acts naturally without being divided by excessive self-observation. And when you abide within that flow, every external material factor, from finances and opportunities to people and circumstances, becomes merely a secondary expression of an inner structure that has become whole. The clearest evidence can be found in individuals who possess the ability to inspire others authentically. They never attempt to inspire through techniques. They simply live in alignment with their original being, and that energy naturally radiates outward. As Carl Jung once observed, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When you have the courage to live truthfully as yourself, you do not need to struggle to influence or change others. You transform them through the energetic field of your presence, and you yourself are also profoundly transformed in the process. This is not the crude power of forced action, but the highest power of being. In practical life, you can verify this principle in any area, from career and relationships to artistic creation. Instead of continually asking yourself, "What must I do to achieve this result?" try redirecting the question toward, "If I were already that whole being, how would I live and act at this very moment?" When you begin to act from the position of "I already am," rather than "I long to become," you immediately restructure your entire energetic frequency. It is like an artist who creates not because they crave outward fame, but because they cannot stop expressing art. That energy, the energy of being unable not to be yourself, is the most enduring and authentic magnetic field of all. This is the point at which the Jungian journey reaches complete fulfillment. When a person fully abandons the frantic search for meaning in the external world, stops using spirituality as a tool for acquiring more, and begins to live as a living embodiment of meaning. When you operate from that silent center, you no longer use life to obtain any isolated objective, but devote your entire existence to expressing what you truly are. This way of living makes no illusory promise that you will possess everything the ego desires, but it offers a far greater commitment. You will no longer be dependent on the need to obtain. And within that boundless freedom, you officially become the current of life itself, fluid, abundant, and radiant. You no longer need to exhaust yourself, searching for light in some distant place, because you have become the pure prism through which the light of the universe freely shines. Everything that comes afterward, love, career, peace, becomes only a natural sign, confirming that you are living in complete alignment with the frequency of your soul. This way of living is not a small trick for attracting good things from the universe, but a courageous invitation to return and reclaim sovereignty over your inner world. You no longer strain yourself to demand or seize anything from outside, but simply recognize the value that has always existed within. When the inner world has become truly whole and still, every boundary and every vague search naturally disappears. Your journey officially comes to an end, not through expensive material possessions, but through the purest peace within the soul. Today's journey through the philosophy of Carl Jung is not an invitation to reject life or abandon responsibility. Doing nothing has never meant the stagnation of someone who has failed, but rather the sacred alchemical stillness of a soul that has matured. It is the moment when you courageously remove the mask of the ego, cease frantically using rigid willpower to force reality, and bravely return the direction of your life to the profound wisdom of the self. When you learn the art of remaining still amid the storms of the mind, you will discover a wondrous truth. The universe has never demanded that you strain yourself to become someone else. Every attempt at control, born from fear, only interrupts the natural flow. But when you dare to lay down your weapons and live fully in pure presence at this very moment, every piece of your life begins to arrange itself naturally into its rightful place. You no longer have to exhaust yourself searching for the light, because the profound stillness within has transformed you into the brightest lamp of all. If you have remained with us until these final moments of the live stream, then somewhere within you there must already be a space quiet enough for Carl Jung's perspectives to reach you and sink deeply into your awareness. Your complete presence throughout today's sharing is the clearest evidence that your soul is genuinely longing for transformation at the deepest level, rather than merely seeking superficial solutions. The journey back to your original being has never been an easy path, and you absolutely do not have to walk it alone. If today's moments of stillness and insight have brought you a sense of inner refuge or offered even a single guiding suggestion to your soul, please click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. This simple click is not merely a way of following a content channel. It is a way of creating a regular appointment with stillness for yourself. A safe space where we can sit together, release the pressures of daily life, and listen to the deepest voice within. Thank you for offering your precious and complete presence to today's live stream. May you have enough courage to pause, enough trust to let go, and enough serenity to witness the most beautiful things naturally gathering around your life. Goodbye, and I look forward to meeting you again on the next journey of awakening.